All right, perfect. I hope you guys have had a wonderful week. It's great to see you all back here on the last day of MSC. My name is Dan Butrym. I'm a professional services engineer out of Atlanta.
And I'm Chris Sheets. I'm a professional services engineer based out of Syracuse, New York.
So today we're going to talk about moving to O365 from on-prem Exchange and how MobileIron can assist you in getting your devices over to that system. So we're going to start with a little bit of architecture. We're going to move into some stages to migrate, things you need to be thinking about. Then we're going to finish up with some information, some places for you to go get additional resources, and then any questions you guys may have.
All right, let's go ahead and kick this off. Just a quick show of hands out here. Is anybody using integrated Sentry? No? All right. Anybody not using Sentry? Okay, fantastic. So let's take a little comparison here and look at the difference between the integrated and standalone. Most of what we're talking about today, we're going to focus on standalone, but just kind of want to expose you guys to the different products that we actually have for ActiveSync. So looking at the integrated Sentry itself, we'll support both of these products. Recommended numbers, when we're talking about going through Sentry or using Sentry with Office 365, anything that exceeds 5,000 devices, we're going to want to recommend that you use the standalone Sentry. Okay? Now, in terms of how Microsoft perceives this, they don't necessarily recommend any type of proxy sitting in line with Office 365. That being said, we have a great deal of customers that use this, are successful with it, works, no issues. In terms of the integrated Sentry, since it's not standing in line, I mean, there isn't any issues there. We're just sending PowerShell commands. This is going to be installed on a Windows box, and Dan will talk about this a little bit more coming up here in just a few slides. In terms of deployment, your standalone Sentry, we're going to put that in DMZ, and then the integrated Sentry is typically going to sit on the internal network on your Windows box. Now, in terms of the compliance actions, with standalone Sentry, when somebody violates a policy, Sentry is just going to cut off access to O365 near real time, almost instantaneous. In terms of integrated Sentry, there could be a little bit of a lag there. It's all going to be based on how long that next sync is. So you may find that a user violates a policy, and it could be a couple hours. Depending on how many devices you have in there, that sync could take longer, so that compliance action may take a bit longer than you would really want it to. Now, in terms of the email clients, you can use a native email client on both, but in terms of using attachment control, if you really want to leverage that, then on the using the integrated Sentry, you're going to have to stick with some type of containerized PIM client, such as Email Plus. Now, in terms of bypassing the Sentry, with a standalone Sentry, we're going to have to leverage some ADFS claims rules to handle that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up. Not really worried about that with integrated Sentry because we're not sitting in line. You're going to direct users right to O365.
All right, so when we talk about Sentry architecture and where you're going to put these things, we need to really think about your O365 environment and what type you've purchased, right? So show of hands, who has O365 today, or you're getting into it? Okay. Of that crowd, who has a dedicated tenant? Oh, okay, more than I thought. And then the rest of you, I'm assuming, are multi-tenant. So what we're talking about for the rest of you that aren't aware of that, with O365, you can purchase what's a dedicated tenant. It's essentially your O365 environment. You're not sharing servers with other people, it's yours. So when we're talking that way, you're only going to need one or a couple scaled Sentries to make sure that you have the connectivity you need. And the reason we're bringing this up is because with some of these global organizations that you all have, we want to make sure that you have these Sentries spread out, and I'm going to get into that performance in just a few minutes. Now, even if multi-tenant, right, we're only suggesting that you put, a Sentry or Sentries in front of that multi-tenant environment at O365 to make sure that you have the configuration and load balancing that you're looking for. But that leads me over to having a multi-tenant environment across multiple regions, right? So the key thing here is that you do not want devices from EMEA long hauling all the way back to the US to get to the Sentry to then get out to O365. So if you're a multinational corporation, make sure that you place Sentries in your other regions close to the environment that they're going to be accessing and ultimately your end users' devices, right? We want to make sure that that lag is as minimal as possible. Now for you dedicated folks, it's a little bit more difficult, right? Because you only have one entry spot into O365. So kind of try to plan that accordingly. There may be some degradation as far as the long haul traffic, but you are going to experience that either with or without Sentry. Now, when we talk about integrated Sentry, we're talking about sticking a Windows machine internal to your network. And essentially, as Chris pointed out earlier, it's only making PowerShell commands out to the O365 environment. So from a device perspective, you are not routing any mail on-prem. You're going directly to O365. But as he also pointed out, there could be some delay in the time that it takes for a device that's checked in, that's non-compliant, to get that action out to the integrated Sentry and thus over to O365 to remove their access to mail. So you might want to think about that. If your device count is in the 3,000 plus range, start leaning a little more towards standalone Sentry. I think you're going to have a lot better performance, and your end users ultimately are going to be happier. All right, so Chris is going to take us through some of the stages to migrate here. Let me build this out for him.
So,
I'm sorry. My bad.
There you go. So two approaches that we could really take to this. We're either going to do a migration. We're going to cover these steps a little bit more in detail throughout the presentation, but or we can just do a cutover. We're just going to push everybody over to Office 365 at once. Talk about some of the advantages, disadvantages of both of these, but mainly we're going to focus on the migration. So as part of the migration, we're just going to want to stand up some new sentries, different entry point, so we can slowly move people over. In order to do so, we're going to set up a new set of Exchange configs, and then we're going to push users over to these new Exchange configs using criteria-based labels. And then in terms of testing, we just want to validate everything. Make sure that we got all our ducks in a row prior to actually, beginning the migration process. And then we're actually going to go through the migration and then do some cleanup at the end. Dan's going to talk all about that, what you're looking for, what you really want to, clean up in the environment prior to, finalizing and saying we're done with the migration. Cutover. Probably a lot of you aren't going to actually do a cutover. I mean, that's just like pulling the Band-Aid. We're just going to push everybody over, but always test, make sure we're ready to do it. We're just going to make some modifications to both the Sentry and the Exchange config, and then we're actually going to begin the cutover process.
So I'm going to get into a little bit of detail on kind of how to fall into which one of those options, right? Are you doing it over time or are you doing it slow in just a second? Just show of hands, how many people have, or are we talking like over 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 devices? Almost everybody, but surprisingly on our first one we had almost nobody with less devices.
Right.
So if you are in that group that's maybe less than 500 or less than 1,000 devices, the possibility of doing a planned cutover, like a one night type of shift, is actually maybe applicable to you.
All right, in terms of authentication, how many of you are leveraging Kerberos right now on your on-prem Exchange environments? It's fantastic, right? Don't have to enter passwords. Users change their AD password, they don't have to update it. Unfortunately, when we move to Office 365, that's no longer an option. This is something you're going to need to prep your end users with because they're probably not used to it. They may never have had to enter a password on their device for email. But as soon as we flip the switch, put them over 365, they're going to get prompted to authenticate. So you just want to make sure you prep everybody for this change.
I'll leave that up for just a second so you can get this picture. All right. All right, so when we're talking about standalone Sentry, again, back to your global architecture, right? I really want you to visualize this. This is why we built this slide out. It's because I want you to think, like, I have people in other regions. I need to make sure there's sentries. And I know this slide only shows a sentry per region, but I really want you to think about having multiple sentries in each of these regions to have that HA, not only for having load balance abilities, but also for things like upgrade schedules. As you want to move your sentries down the road to a new version, it'd be nice to be able to take one offline while still not impacting end user business.
All right, our labels. Two approaches we can take here, and both are going to use filter-based labels. I mean, ideally, that's where you hopefully apply all your configurations. But in terms of how you're going to move people over to the new Exchange configurations that you create, we have a security group. We could always move people from that one security group into another. LDAP sync occurs, label switches out, new config on the device. Ideally, you want to automate this process. Set it, forget it. Every time we migrate a mailbox up to O365 from on-prem, you're going to have an attribute in AD that's going to change. Let's leverage that. Let's take that attribute, let's put a label attached to it, and then as you move people over, you guys don't have to do anything. It's going to happen on the back end. Next time LDAP sync occurs, they're going to get their new profile.
All right. So what are you going to change in the mail configuration that you have today once you move to O365? You're going to make some adjustments to it. Right now, most of you are probably leveraging $ user ID $ in your mail configuration. Once you move out to O365, whether you're doing the cutover or the planned planned migration, you're going to have to make that change, right? It's going to be $email. Now, we put this slide up there because lately we've seen some people's Active Directory where they actually didn't have, or they had some mismatch values within their AD structure. So if that's something that you may run into, think about that ahead of time before you start your migration. Make sure you go back, get with your Active Directory team, review these accounts, and make sure it's consistent, by the way. As many of you have either been absorbed or bought other companies, you may have some differences in the Active Directory structure of these new companies that you brought in. Maybe you were first, not last, and they were last, not first, or there's spaces involved. Think about that. Make sure you review the entire list of people that you have before you get going and find out, oh my gosh, I can't move this person. They have an issue with their Active Directory account.
All right, let's talk about placing those sentries in different regions. So for a global company, we have sentries in each region. You know, we don't want it that long haul to get that traffic, multiple hops. How are you going to direct these users to these particular sentries that you have placed in each location? Ideally, if you have a global load balancer, we can create a single namespace. So sentry.mobileiron.com. We just have 3 sets of configurations for email in that case. Maybe you have, you know, one for iOS, one for Android, and if you're using Windows, same thing there. Otherwise, if we don't have a global load balancer, we're going to have to create Exchange configurations for each region. So you're going to have, you know, possibly 21 different Exchange configurations if you're using 3 OSs in 7 different regions. So that's going to be a lot more overhead in terms of creating the Exchange configurations in the system. But I mean, we do have customers that have to take that approach. They don't necessarily have a global load balancer. How many of you actually could leverage something like that today? Okay.
4.
So, I mean, if you have that, you could just use some type of geolocation, you know, algorithm within the load balancer to handle that and actually push those users to the appropriate region set of sentries.
All right. So I want to talk about best practices for Sentry. I'm going to build this whole slide out. All right. So obviously we're talking about an internet-facing device. We're going to make sure that this has a third-party SSL certificate on it, right? We used to let you stand this up kind of for testing. Even if you're doing testing, you're getting planned for your migration, get the third-party SSL certificate. Like, just don't waste your time. You don't even want your test devices showing up and saying, I don't trust this Sentry because the name doesn't match, right? So let's make sure we have that locked down. Number 2, we recommend high availability, as I said before, right? If for nothing else, the ability to be able to do upgrades later on down the road, have multiple sentries. From our licensing model, you can stick as many sentries as you want. It does not matter. It's all the same. We also recommend at professional services that you leverage identity certificates, right? Make sure these devices, as they show up to Sentry, prove who they are, right? It provides another layer of security, and again, makes your environment better. Something to think about when we're talking about the Sentry itself. When devices used to connect to on-prem Exchange, they were connecting directly to the Sentry, and then the Sentry would hand off the traffic to the on-prem Exchange. So the timeouts for that connection between the Sentry and their internal Exchange were very short. When we're talking about going to O365 now, we need to build in a little bit more time so that we can keep alive that connection from these devices ultimately out to O365. So we do have the recommended settings up on the board. It's a slight adjustment over what's stock, but think about that, especially if you start to see some degradation in performance on your O365. That may be one of those areas that you just maybe overlooked, and that could perhaps fix those issues. Now again, when we're talking about that standalone Sentry configuration, right now you may have it pointed to your on-prem Exchange. Whether you're building a new Sentry or not, this is where you're ultimately going to be targeting, which is outlook.office365.com. I put that out there a lot because people ask me, they're like, where's O365? Where do I point the Sentry? That's your address.
And as Dan mentioned here, with the identity certificates, if you're not already using those for two-factor auth today, this is an ideal time to actually make that change, because as you're migrating users to a new Exchange configuration, let's just drop a certificate onto that config as well. That way, you're going to have to flip it, so opportune time right there. All right, so let's start talking about the active sync flow here with our standalone. As we can see, the device over on the left side of the screen here, the application is active sync. That's going to come through, it's going to hit the Sentry, and now as the Sentry becomes the client hitting Office 365, that's the source IP address. As that redirect occurs to ADFS, the user is simply just going to have to enter their username and password in AD, and that's where they're going to receive their mailbox sync once they've authenticated properly. So a little bit on claims rules. First thing you're going to really need to do is evaluate your policies. What type of traffic are we looking to block here? I mean, are we only going to allow active sync coming from the Sentry? There's multiple services that hit Office 365. It could be EWS, could be OWA. Are you going to allow users to open up browsers on their devices and still continue to connect? Because as you set some of these rules, I mean, they can have a global effect on all the users within the organizations, depending on what type of method they're trying to use to hit Office 365 and where the traffic may be possibly coming from. A little more detail here. As the device initially hits the Sentry, here's where we can do the two-factor auth. We're going to present a certificate to the Sentry. If we don't have that certificate, if we haven't enrolled with MobileIron, we're not going to have the ability to get that certificate. So you can prevent users from simply plugging in the Sentry's FQDN on their device to try to sync to the Sentry directly. Once we've authenticated successfully to the Sentry, we're just going to do a source IP. Make sure that when that hits the IDP, that the traffic is actually coming from the Sentry. Has this been added to the list of trusted IP addresses where we accept traffic coming from? Once we are actually making a connection successfully, the user is just going to get prompted for their password. Plug the username and password in successfully, and then we grant access to that user. And we have an unmanaged device here. What happens when that unmanaged device tries to hit? Maybe they're trying to hit Office 365 directly. So you've protected your Sentry from making a direct connection simply by using identity certificates. But what about users plugging directly into Office 365? Well, based on claims rules, you can set that to say traffic is coming from some unknown source IP address. So we're just going to deny the access to that user. So we have to have a device coming from a trusted network as well as a trusted device itself. So some of the common claims rules that we see, proxy, where's that traffic coming from? Is it coming from internal resources on your network? Is it coming from the outside? So you can make different claims rules based on where the traffic is originating from. Two of the most common ones that we see in use, source IP address. Want to make sure that that traffic is actually coming from your Sentries. And then of course the app itself. We want to say active sync. So a combination of these two is what typically most customers will start with.
I think we have some values of that, so you can get a look at what we're saying here.
Yeah. So a little bit in the weeds here, but you can see on the top the application exists. So what we're looking for is that Microsoft Exchange Active Sync. We know that that's the application that's coming in, and then we're just going to combine that rule and say if the IP address does not come from the source of the Sentry, then we're going to issue a deny. We're not going to let that user pass through, so we're going to block them out. I mean, using this is effectively blocking, just like for your on-prem Exchange environments where you typically just go in, IIS virtual directory, and you're just going to block all traffic except that comes from the source IP of your Sentries. Same approach here, just a different way of going about doing it.
All right, so how do you get these claims rules out and what do you do with them, right? So we obviously think go ahead, set up your configuration to O365, get a couple test accounts, and then get into building the claims rules as Chris described. And we do have some documentation at the end of this, some links in our slides that'll take you to more examples of claims rules, right? You can get super deep in the weeds on that, and I will put you all to sleep. But essentially, it makes sense, right? Validate the claims rule, build something out simple. Don't go for the full tilt home run on the first shot, right? Start with one thing, add another layer to that cake to make sure that you're getting the effective denial that you want for the devices that are connecting to O365. Move a couple mailboxes over. Make sure that your claim rule still works, right? Maybe it worked for the test account that Microsoft gave you, but it doesn't work for that first mailbox that you moved over. And again, when you're doing this, right, when you're actually doing your configuration cutover, we talked about using filter labels. When you're doing your testing, please only use manual labels, right? Only one person's device at a time or a couple test devices at a time. Don't go taking the entire IT department and throwing them down the hallway until we're absolutely sure we're ready to go. Hopefully, the end result is what we were expecting. All right, so I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Two types of cutover strategy, right? So the folks with smaller number of device counts, you may actually be able to move to O365. And the reason, in a night or a weekend, and the reason I bring this up is that I've had some smaller customers that they were more told they needed to move to O365 rather than being really planned out action, right? It was like, hey, we got to move this weekend. We need to do it right now. What are the steps, right? So when you're thinking about that type of strategy, what are you going to be doing, right? Over communicate this to the end users. Hey, your mailboxes are moving to O365 this weekend. You expect to see some changes on both your laptop and on your devices. Make sure they're aware of what's happening. Educate your help desk. I say that on both sides, but I can't stress it enough. Make sure these folks know what's going to happen when users call in. My mailbox is gone. My contacts aren't there. What am I supposed to be seeing? What do I do? Can I refresh? Where do I go? Over-educate your help desk before you start.
And that's just critically important if your users are used to not having to enter the password. I mean, if you're using Kerberos, reiterate to them many times, you're going to get prompted for a password in this case.
Absolutely. So staying with the kind of overnight migration, right? We talked about it, but you're going to go and actually change your Sentry configuration. Right now it's pointed to on-prem Exchange, point it to O365. Change those timeout values we talked about. Hopefully you're not trying to change the name of your Sentry and thus need a new third-party certificate, else everything you had in place before should stay okay. Then go and modify that Exchange profile that you have that's pushed out to the devices. After the mailbox is removed that night, change the mail configuration, everybody will get pushed their new mailbox, and hopefully you'll be good to go. With the rest of us that have larger environments, that's not going to work, right? We have thousands of mailboxes, they're huge, and it takes a long time for your IT to be able to push these over. That's where we want you to start thinking about building out additional Sentries, right? Leave your on-prem Exchange stuff the way that it's working today, don't mess with it, take and build brand new, use new external name, new external third-party certificate. And as you go, make the change for a new profile, right? That's where these new filter labels that are associated to this new configuration come into play. So as Chris pointed out earlier, ultimately when your Exchange team goes ahead and does that mailbox cutover, there's an attribute change in LDAP, use that to your advantage. So it's almost automated for the end user. As the IT team finishes their work that evening usually, the mailbox gets moved over, the end user's device will see that new filter label and get the new configuration for O365. So it's almost as seamless as it could be. Unfortunately for the Kerberos folks, they will have to authenticate at least one time. All right, so after you've done that, what's the next step? So if you're doing the long-term move over, a couple things that you could do, right? So I've seen a lot of customers recently, they have old Sentries that were pointed to their on-prem Exchange. What do we do with them? Right, so you could either convert them to maybe App Connect Sentries, right? Use them for some type of tunneling, or just flip it over and start using it with O365, right? If you have to do a little reconfiguration, add it back to the pool. Maybe now you have 3 Sentries that can take in some connectivity and push it out. If you're the type that's going to be moving away from the not one night, but over time, I want you to make sure that after you're done, delete any of the old instances that you see for your on-prem Exchange. I don't want anybody's backup admin or help desk team on the other side of the world to go in and accidentally associate a device to an old configuration. It's going to be a terrible user experience. And after we have everyone moved over, we want to make sure that they're getting what they're supposed to be getting. And then the old labels, right? We talked about creating new labels and getting those filter labels in place. Again, degrade all that stuff out of your system, get it out of there, just make sure that there's not a chance of something accidentally happening.
Yeah, just general housekeeping here, make the system clean.
So that's pretty much it for our explanation of what to think about. I hope it gave you guys some idea of how to get started, kind of get some balls rolling here. We'd love to show you some additional information out at the community.mobileiron.com. There's a lot of discussion that's going on. O365 is a hot topic. Pretty much every one of your peers in this room right now are thinking about this or already in terms of doing it. I mean, many of you that are sitting in here that I work with understand it's happening right now. But check out some of the rest of these links that we have out here. Again, best practices. Out on the community, search for claims rules. There's lots and lots and lots of information from Rich Vestante and his team in regard to getting that done.